Muy buenos días a todos, comunidad jurídica, política y social latinoamericana. Bienvenidos todos ustedes al Seminario Latinoamericano de Derechos Humanos, organizado por la UNITEC Colombia y UPAEP México. Muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes y en particular pues iniciamos enviando algunos saludos, lógicamente, por parte de lo que es la UPAEP, a nuestro rector, a mi rector, el doctor Emilio Baños Ardamín, y por parte de la UNITEC, a la rectora Wilmar Chinchilla, a la vicerrectora Carolina Jaimes y a mi vicerrector Mariano Sánchez Cuevas. De igual manera, también por la participación y apoyo que hemos recibido para este seminario, damos nuestro más cordial saludo al personero Julián Enrique Pinilla Malagón. Muchísimas gracias también por todo el apoyo de la Personería de Colombia. Igualmente, saludo a mi par, la directora de Derecho de UNITEC, la doctora Francia Hernández. Un caluroso abrazo a la distancia. Y pues me permito presentarme, yo soy el doctor Fernando Méndez Sánchez, director de la Facultad de Derecho de UPAEP. Y pues ahora otra vez estamos de manteles largos con conferencia magistral. Tengo el gusto que nos esté acompañando en esta ocasión el doctor Ricardo Strauss Abelín con la conferencia magistral de la hospitalidad temporal a la pertenencia, un análisis del derecho de los otros frente al binomio soberanía, derechos humanos. Me permito leer un poco la reseña del doctor Ricardo. Él es catedrático de Derecho del Centro Universitario Metodista IPA, miembro del Consejo Editorial de la revista Ciencia en Movimiento, doctor en Ciencias Sociales por Unicinos, magíster en Derecho por Unicinos también, y licenciado en Ciencias Jurídicas y Sociales por la misma institución. Realizó un curso avanzado de Relaciones Internacionales en el International People's College de Helsingør, Dinamarca, y actualmente tiene una maestría en Derecho Europeo y Alemán por la UFRGS. Antes de dar la palabra a nuestro invitado, muchísimas gracias, maestro Ricardo, por haber aceptado la invitación y por encontrarse acá. Una breve introducción nada más, recordarles a todos los alumnos, UNITEC, USAL, UPAE, por favor, que lo que viene a ser la liga de registro ya se encuentra publicada ahorita en nuestras redes sociales, preponderantemente aquí en YouTube, para que sea a través de la misma donde hagan su registro. Les recomiendo utilizar el chat sobre todo para sus comentarios y sus preguntas. Sin nada más que agregar, doctor Ricardo, la palabra es suya y muchas gracias, muchas por esta participación magistral. Escuchamos atentos. Su ponencia, a todos se les advierte, será en inglés. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fernando Sanchez. It's a pleasure to be with you and all the students from different universities. I apologize for having to speak it in English, this lecture, but it's due to the fact that even though I have studied Spanish, lately I've been studying also Italian, and it's becoming very difficult to conciliate both languages. So I thought it would be better also to present in English. So let us start with this subject that is from temporary hospitality to the right to belong, an analysis of the right of the others in face of binomial sovereignty and human rights. We are going to travel through a different range of authors to deal with the complex issue that relates to these lately images that I think you have seen recently on broadcast. The image on the left is you see people running, joining an airplane in Kabul city airport. They're trying to flee from very difficult situations, which we call a part of something that we call humanitarian crisis. Humanitarian crisis is, to international law, what happens when a great number of countries in the world have such difficulties to implement the human rights that people want to flee these countries, and the numbers have been increasing, as we are going to see. And then we come to migrant crisis, which is depicted on the photo on the right, as you can see, the Haitians trying to enter the United States in pursuit of a better quality of life. As as they try to enter the United States, they're blocked by border patrol from the United States, which doesn't allow them to enter the country. So this is a migrant crisis. When many people want to flee their countries, is humanitarian crisis, and the migrant crisis is when they're blocked in their pursuit of enter these countries where they would have better quality of life, a more meaningful life, as they come from places where there are not too many opportunities to make their lives meaningful. And what are the main causes of this humanitarian and migrant crisis? Well, I think the first thing that authors have been bringing, among them Philip Blom, the German historian, is it is important for us, and also Anthony Giddens has been pointing out the rise of world population as we come from 2.5 billion people in the 50s. If we remember Elvis Presley, this is the 50s, and the population from Elvis Presley to now has tripled. It's come to more than triple, and we come to 7.8 billion people currently, and we are predicted to reach 8.5 and 8.5 billion by 2030. So this rise of population creates a lot of problems, to be honest, although the rise of world population is important economically, and also to maintain the states, the configuration of the states that we have today. But then we have problems of wealth concentration, which creates extreme poverty, and the automation or the equipments and the industry become more and more automatic, as this creates unemployment. And then you have the difference of salaries between countries that are industrialized and non-industrialized. So people who come from countries that pay very little wages, salaries, they try to migrate to countries where they will earn much more, which is a natural humanitarian. And this migration is a historic process that has always happened throughout the history. But now all these causes that we're seeing, these factors, have been making it increase. Also, the climate crisis that we're living, which tends to increase this problem, and the type of wars that we live today. We have terrorism of state, is the state practicing terrorism, as we see in Syria, for example, which impacts much more the civilians because they bomb civilians. It is different from the Geneva Convention, 1949 Geneva Convention, that prohibits the attacks on civilians. But today, the state behaves as a terrorist and attacks civilians, and then civilians in a larger number in these longer wars that never finish, like the Syrian war. They have to flee to different countries. So the numbers of people migrating is increasing. We have today 79.5 billion displaced people. And this term displaced people, it includes refugees, which are those who are fleeing from persecution because of religious reasons, racial reasons, political reasons, because they belong to a certain group or ethnic group, and they're no longer safe in their countries. And then we also have the migrants who want to have a better life. So the great number of people moving. Today, we have already 281 million people living outside their countries. And this numbers is growing from 2010 to 2020. In a 60 million migrants have been gone into this, and more than a half are refugees. So it is such a situation that the authors, and this we call about Castles and Haas, have coined this term that we are living in an age of migration, and an age where migration has taken increasing political salience, is becoming an issue that goes to the agenda of the politicians. They discuss more and more about the age of migration. And as Ulrich Beck, Anthony Giddens, and Philip Blom say, there is a certain nostalgia today because we live in a society with so many risks and uncertainties. People want to reestablish a past, want to live as we lived in the past, with more security. And then we see also this effect in the politicians, as some politicians come up to say, okay, we're for the family, the traditional family, we are for the protection of the religion, we want to live as we used to live before. But then, as we see in Philip Blom and Anthony Giddens, this is no longer possible because we are so many in the world today, and countries have become much more interdependent. We depend much more, and what happens in one country affects the others. So the idea of sovereignty that we used to have, and a nation state is powerful, we want a powerful leader who will put things in order, is no longer possible because it doesn't depend on him alone. In a financial crisis in 2008 affected the economy of the whole world. I remember our then President Lula in Brazil said, this is gonna come, if it comes to reach Brazil, it's gonna be very weak. And actually, when it came to Brazil, it did delay a little bit to arrive. It took a bit longer to arrive, but when it arrived, it affected so strongly that even a president fell down. President Dilma was, according to my studies, was affected by these economic problems of the financial crisis 2008. And also today, just this week, was announced the closure of a Volkswagen industry here in Brazil, in São Paulo, because of the photo on the right, on the bottom of the right, the ships are no longer arriving. Something that happens back there in China will affect our economy. And not to say the pandemics that starts in Asia and is spread the whole world, changing our lives, or the poverty in a certain or political crisis in Venezuela will make people go to different countries, including Brazil. And there on the left, on the bottom in the left, you will see this Mercedes-Benz flooded in Germany. It doesn't affect only the developing countries, but it affects also the European West European countries like Germany, wealthy countries. So all these problems that we're dealing with have been dealt by important authors. This thing of migration. So we come from a thinking from Kant. We will enjoy a little bit of the thinking of Kant, which Zygmunt Bauman says Kant has never been so current, so important to today's world. It is amazing what he wrote in 1795 in his Perpetual Peace book, is an essay he wrote, is becoming so important to today's reality. And then we have Hannah Arendt, who herself was a refugee and was a stateless person as she flew from German Nazism, from the Nazism government in Germany. And then Sila bin Habib, who has also been important author in this issue, and she updates what these two previous authors have been speaking, and she brings this to today's reality. So we come from cosmopolitan right of Kant to temporary hospitality of Kant, and then we come to the right to have rights, which is a term by which Hannah Arendt is mostly known, and the right to belong. And then we see this binomial conflicts between human rights and sovereignty, nation state and global governance that we're facing today, as we want to provide, as law has this task of providing regulation for a peaceful world. So I'd like to start by entering a little bit into content, and this phrase from Bauman in his book Strangers at the Door, written in 2016, just 1 year before his death. He wrote this book. It's a very important book. It speaks about migration as a strange, and he says more than 2 years after Kant wrote his book, we're still procrastinating in attending his appeal to hospitality. And then let's see what this appeal of Kant is, what Kant thought about. So Kant is known, and I'm going to pass fast here because I don't want to take too much time, but I wanted to introduce for the students an idea of Kant. Kant is a Luminist author, and he valorized much the use of reason, the intellect, to think. He says, to know what is right and wrong, we can do by thinking. We know what is right is wrong. And then he is known by some phrases like, live your life as though your every act were to become a universal law. As if you are a robber and you start to rob, this would be an example for others. If everybody robs, then we live in a world where it is as all against all, as Hobbes have said. So we have to behave in a certain way that can be replied by others, and we still live in peace. And then he also says, always treat people as end in themselves, never as means to an end, and not to use. We are here to share knowledge, this cosmopolitan idea, to learn with each other, not to use the other. And then from this phrase, also from these ideas of Kant, has influenced so much the principle of human dignity that is the core of the human rights system. So treat people as ends in themselves is to recognize the other's humanity, treat them according to certain standards of human dignity and worthiness. It doesn't, from that, the principle of human dignity doesn't allow that people come to some certain situations that are not coherent with the human dignity. And then we come to the foreigners, to migration. Kant writes about it in his Perpetual Peace. He says, we do have a cosmopolitan right, a kind of previous idea of a human right, which doesn't depend on which country you are. It doesn't depend on your nationality. You have the right to move, because he says we live in a spherical world, which analyzing reasoning, it's all made as a common possession of the surface of the earth. We all human beings are owners. We have the possession of this world. And because of it, we have the right in this circular world, spherical world, to go around. This is to do with our nature. It's reasonable to think that we want to associate with people from other countries and learn this cosmopolitan idea of learning with the differences. And this is the freedom that we have to go around the different countries. And so from this comes the idea to Kant that we are to be hosted, at least temporarily, by other countries. As to say, we have a cosmopolitan right to temporary hospitality. And then coming back to those photos of Haitians trying to enter the United States, Kant would say they have the right, a cosmopolitan right to enter. And Kant goes further. He says, if if getting to the other country is necessary so that the person doesn't get to Untergang, this is destruction, uh, withdrawn. If the person not being accepted to the United States, for example, or to Brazil or any other countries, coming from a difficult situation, they ought to be accepted, especially, he will say, if not accepting would cause the destruction of that person, as to return to a country where they have no food to eat, as we have heard from some people, migrants who came from even Latin American countries in situations of great poverty, and they arrived in Brazil and said we had to come because we didn't have food to give to our kids, which is a situation we also have in Brazil, but it can go to different levels, and I think those Kant will say those who have better conditions are to receive those who are not in such good conditions. And he also explains and brings examples from his time, victims of religious wars, victims of piracy, shipwreckage are to be accepted in the foreign countries. It's not a matter of philanthropy. It's a matter of right to enter. And Heine Bielefeld, the philosopher from Germany, has recently said also, him and Bauman been saying, these ideas of Kant have becoming so current, so important to nowadays because of climate change, as people have to flee countries where it's impossible to live because of the climate weather, which is a tendency. And also, Heine Bielefeld brings a point that nothing is so definitive to someone's life as his nationality, the place where you were born. If you are born, are we to condemn the person because of the place they're born? If a person is born in a country that is extreme poor and have no conditions, and then you have persons living and being born in countries of West Europe or the United States, Australia and others, just because of the place where you were born, how can it have such definite importance on the person's future? And then Heine Bielefeld would say, this is also a reason for ethical thinking about it, how important it is that people are welcome in other countries. So also Kant would say, once they enter, should not be treated as an enemy, because Kant said, after the colonization of European colonization of the world, as the Europeans spread through the world, now there's nowhere else to spread, to disperse. We have reached all boundaries of the world. So now we have to, and the number of humanity, the number of people in the world has increased, as I showed before. So we now have to tolerate the presence of each other, says Kant. It's time for us to learn to tolerate the presence of each other. And this is, according to Zygmunt Bauman, a very special message from Kant, that now is more than ever a time for solidarity and cooperation amidst the strangers. I mean, we have in the world very different cultures possible. People from Islamic tradition, Christian tradition, Buddhist traditions. These are strange cultures to each other. In his book, Strangers at the Door, people from different nations. But now it's time for us to learn their cultures in this cosmopolitan spirit that Kant brings. And Kant has influenced, what he wrote in 1795 has influenced the 1951 Refugee Convention, as Article 33 of this convention brought the principle of non-refoulement, which is forbids the expel of or return of a refugee. So today, Article 33 prohibits that action we saw in the beginning of the lecture of the Haitians being expelled from the United States as they gather under the Texan Bridge and they want to enter the United States and stay there. It says, no contracting state shall expel or return a refugee in any manner whatsoever to the frontiers of territories where his life freedom would be threatened on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. So this, now moving to Hannah Arendt, this temporary sojourn that Kant defends is also defended by Hannah Arendt, who herself has lived under major threats as she fled German Nazism. She says it's a moral and legal violation to deny the entrance of refugees. Hannah Arendt is better known as she lived a period of totalitarian regimes, as written in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, where people were denationalized. As she speaks, between the First and Second World Wars, people, uh, especially minorities, because of the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, people like the Jews, the Gypsies, and others had to no longer, they were deprived of the nationalities. They were in their countries, like say Jews in Germany, but suddenly they became stateless. Stateless is when you have no longer nationality, or become a refugee, have to flee to another country because you suddenly are persecuted. And then people come to a human condition in which they need to have the right to have rights. And this is to Hannah Arendt the most important right. This is what she focuses, the right to have rights. If we look at these photos here, as we see Haitians under the Texan Bridge, or in Italy, the photo below, a woman lying down near the Termini station in downtown Rome, or the other one on the right, the photo of a refugee camp, and we can better understand the idea of the right to have rights, this expression by which Hannah Arendt is most known for. How can you exercise? What rights do you have if you are in a situation like this? Can you exercise the right of health? Can you exercise the health of education? Can you have access to job? No. First, you have to have the right to have rights. You have to be recognized as a refugee. And then we have this photograph on the right top with Angela Merkel, who, implementing the 1951 Refugee Convention, is a matter of political will. She hosted many refugees in Germany, and then the article that is depicted here says 300,000 refugees were employed in Germany. And this comes to when Hannah Arendt speaks, what is the right to have rights? She says, this is the right to belong to some community. It's the right in which one is judged by one's actions and opinions and not by the place you were born. Right to have rights is the human right that matters to Hannah Arendt. And she says this should be guaranteed by humanity, because we as human beings should have the will, the volition that people are inserted and are accepted into one country, are integrated into one country. But then comes also a question that Ben Habib brings, that is not uh, human rights, or if we want to use expression from Hannah Arendt, the right to belong depends also on sovereignty. And this is where human rights get into conflict with sovereignty, because the states have um, have assumed the compromise in the 1951 Convention of Refugees, or even in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They, which is a document that is not self-implemented, that is not binding, but still countries have assumed the compromise to implement it. But if you see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 14, this is the article that's known as the most problematic article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it says everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution, but it doesn't say that everyone has the right to obtain asylum. So the person can be like refugees in orbit. We use this expression. They go searching for a country that would grant them the condition of asylum. Without the condition of asylum, people will be in a situation like this. And I have been recently to Italy. And I did part of my research in Italy to see that they are living something that is very similar to what we live in Latin American countries as people, but now refugees and migrants on the street, which are not granted with the refugee condition. They go begging for money on the streets, because they cannot work. This is the right to have rights. To have rights, you need to be recognized as a refugee. You need to have this uh, right to be granted. And no country is obliged to give asylum, because the conventions don't say they are obliged. They keep it to the sovereignty of the state as to say if a person is a refugee or not. And today in Europe, as the extreme right grows politically, the extreme right, more and more the government institutions are denying asylum to people who really need it. Well, I spoke about Italy, uh, and here you see the Italians also have a CPIA, which is a center that has certain integration aspect for foreigners, as they teach the language and break the language border, which so much difficult make difficult the integration in a country. Of course, to be part of a GPA 10 classes, you have to be legally recognized by the state. So if you are fleeing and you have requested an asylum, maybe you don't have the right documentations yet. If you entered Italy illegally, fleeing from a difficult situation, you arrive in Italy with a boat, and you don't get the recognition as a refugee, you will not be able to have the right of education. This is what Hannah Arendt says, the right to have rights. Still too so much in the hands of the state sovereignty to say who has the rights or not. And then Hannah Arendt says, well, okay, that people should be able, she follows Kant, Hannah Arendt follows Kant and says, okay, people should have the right to enter another country, and then should have the right to have rights in this other country. But she says, okay, but there is a limit. The permanent belonging, to stay permanently in a foreign country, is something that is an act of beneficence and not a right of the foreigner, because of the sovereignty of the state to say who stays or who doesn't stay. And here I bring a photo of the permesso di soggiorno of Italy, as this person is authorized to stay in Italy, and some will not get it. The state chooses, and it comes from its sovereignty, who stays, who doesn't stay. And then today, of course, those who have, there is a economic difference. Those who have better conditions economically will be much more likely to be granted a permesso di soggiorno. And those who come from very poor countries and come from very difficult situations will have a very hard time getting a permesso di soggiorno. So they will be rounding around, wandering around the city without anything to do. Arendt says the problem of granting permanent belonging is that we would come to a world government. And I bring these photos of Latin America and the United States, as conditions in Latin America have become more and more difficult. Philip Blom will say something that I find very interesting. He says, we're living in a world that we're facing the border, we're facing a wall, because as the scientists of MIT have said in the report, a 1972 report required by the Rome Club, there is a limit of natural resources in the world. And then we live in an idea, in a dream of economic growth, but we have limited natural resources. And this experiences we're facing are related to this. We're coming to a situation where the resources are scarce to so many people in the world. And then the nation state starts to put walls to block people. And then Hannah Arendt will say, yes, because if we allow everyone into, say, United States, for example, we will need a world government to embrace everyone. And this is where Sila bin Habib, the Yale professor Sila bin Habib, breaks with Kant and Arendt and updates the idea of Kant and Arendt. Says, yes, but this, what Kant and Hannah Arendt said, they said in a context which didn't have such complexity of what we have today, where we have cities that are multicultural, multinational. Naturally, we are mixing up already in this world government, in this world, because people from different nationalities are living in cities like London, where there are more than 179 nationalities, people from 179 different countries living in London today. And many of these nationalities, more than a million people. So this idea also of the increase of international law with its treaties and international institutions, Sila bin Habib will say, because the countries have assumed compromises with treaties like the 1951 Refugee Convention and creating international institutions like the International Criminal Court, we are already creating an international government, will say Sila bin Habib. And this goes towards a global governance to enable the well-being of all human rights. But the truth is that the contradiction remains as people gather in line to request their asylum and have a recognition of their state of refugees, and then be able to use and have rights. So it's there are some changes in, and then I come to the end of the lecture. There are some changes that are needed in the convention, 1951 convention, as to protect the people from the current situations, humanitarian crisis. As we see here, for example, in this photo of Haiti, People are gathering on the downtown area and they don't have anything to do. They don't have job, they don't have a right to education, proper ways, and even to food. So it's what Bauman calls lives wasted. And this calls to the right to development. It's a human right, the right to live in a place where you can develop as a human being and economically too. But this is not protected under 1951 Geneva Convention of the Refugees, because it says a refugee is that person who flees from well-founded fear of being persecuted, and he has to be persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality. People from Haiti are not being exactly persecuted because of race, religion, or anything, but they live in a situation where human rights are violated. According to the current Article 1 of 1951 Geneva Convention, these persons are not refugees, so they don't have the right to have rights. They don't. If they go to the United States might say, okay, they don't apply. They are not in a situation which is predicted in Article 1st of the 1951 Geneva Convention. Because persecutions are tortures, arbitrary detention, arbitrary persecutions, threats to life and freedom, and it's so subjective to say if they are or aren't. So this is something that needs to be changed from 1951 convention. 1951 convention also doesn't predict the environmental refugees. So the areas here in pink are areas of flood in the world, and the areas in yellow are areas of desertification. People who live in these areas are obliged to flee to other countries. And this, when they arrive in the other countries, they again will be in the situation that Hannah Arendt calls the right to have rights, because these will not be recognized as refugees according to the current 1951 convention. And finally, another part of Article 1 that needs to be changed. As you can see, a man hiding inside the structure of a truck, a lorry, is hidden there, trying to flee from Calais in France to England, where he would like to present his asylum request, because Article 1 of the convention says you need to be outside the country of your nationality, that people get those boats and run high risks of life to get to Europe, because you need to be in Europe to request your asylum. And in this case, they want to flee from France to England because in France they have no opportunities, even if they are recognized as refugees. The difficulties are immense to get a job, whereas in England there are more opportunities. Now you think, what are the chances of the elderly and children to flee from a country on a boat where risks are very high, or to hide in a truck like this man? So this is something also that needs to be changed. People must be able to request asylum in the consulate of the country where they want to go, for example. And then finally, what the authors say will be the future for the future. So Bauman speaks about increasing solidarity and cooperation, as we've seen before. Anthony Giddens speaks about tolerance and dialogue, and also an increase in democracy, a transnational governance. Democratizing democracy is the term he uses. And also very important, to regulate and impose tributes in tax havens. these paraísos fiscais, as places where the very rich are gathering immense amounts of money without tributes. And Philip Blom also says we can make a big change by tributary reforms to make quality of life in poor countries better so that migration doesn't have to spread. There is a lot of money, but this money is not being rightly tributed, taxed. And finally, Philip Blom says, well, the most important of it is the will, the volition to change, as people have not yet realized. But then I finish with these images of the movement Fridays for Future, as the new generations are coming and requesting more and more the change. So, uh, as the 1972 report on the limits of growth in the world, made by MIT, said in the middle of this century, by 2015, we would have a change in our system. They wrote in 1972, if we didn't change the way we live for a more circular development, more restriction in the way we live and the way we explore the planet, we would live a crisis which would force us to do it. And Gideon says, as we invade nature, nature is invading us through coronavirus, as his recent interview. As this is all, it is coming apparently, so an increasing conscience of the need to change the way we live in this planet. And with that, I thank you all for the attention. And pass back to Professor
That's
Fernando.
that's a great conference. Thank you very much, Professor Ricardo. Bueno, a todos, Latinoamérica, pues muchísimas gracias también por su atención. Muchos comentarios positivos, a lot of good comments in the chat room, Doctor. For example, one question that make us our student, Liceris Villegas, she says that unfortunately, the migratory phenomena are affected by this negative imaginary where the migrant is an enemy for the nationals and are considered a threat. And in this line, she asks, how do you think that xenophobia affects the hospitality to the Latin American migrant populations towards the developed countries, and what public policy is needed to counteract it?
Thank you very much for the question. Very good question. Yes, I have been, as I mentioned during the lecture, I've been for 6 months, a period of 6 months in Italy recently, as I was able to give my classes online. I went there to do part of my research, and I saw and felt this, which is being questioned, the xenophobia against us Latin Americans. And there's something that Zygmunt Bauman writes about it, and it's not, Zygmunt Bauman is from Poland, so it's an European speaking from their way of thinking, isn't it? It says, we are afraid to become migrants ourselves. He says, we want to defend. He doesn't think like that, but he's saying how Europeans are thinking. Europeans are worried that their way of life is going to change as they see the migrants. Not only they are afraid of losing their jobs, but are afraid also that their way of life would have to change because people from different countries, the migration is a symptom that something is wrong, and they're seeing the symptoms on their streets and they get afraid, and the way they react is with xenophobia. But of course, if we take European history, we will see that they've created apartheid. They have arrived to the Americas and subjugated the native people from Latin America. So they have a history of prejudice. There's Nazism and whatnot. Of course, today, most of the prejudice is not directed to racial, but it's more directed to culture. So they will say, okay, it is a different culture. We are in risk of changing our own culture because people, especially from Islam world, this is where they mostly want to defend. So yes, it's difficult times. Xenophobia is very strong. Also in Denmark, I where I had the opportunity to study, I felt it very much. It was just by the looks. Not being blonde or tall was enough for them to look very different to me. And but still is important, this idea of Kant, the cosmopolitan that changes, and that we can overcome these ideas by understanding each other's culture and enriching by these changes.
Thank you very much. Bueno, Liceris, y para todo el público, traduzco la respuesta. Y en este sentido, sobre todo lo que nos dice, la pregunta que Líceres nos hacía es cómo cree que afecta la xenofobia, la hospitalidad a la población migrante latinoamericana hacia los países desarrollados y qué política pública hace falta para contrarrestarla. En este sentido, lo que viene a hacer el profesor nos señala que desde hace 6 meses, él estudiando justamente en Italia particularmente, pues fue testigo de la xenofobia que en muchas ocasiones también se tiene, no tan solo contra los latinoamericanos, sino contra todas las clases de migrantes. Pero en este sentido, sobre todo, y con una base de estudio en Bauman, señala también que el problema es que los europeos tienen una historia, por principio de cuentas, también, a cierto punto también de xenofobia, de cierta discriminación, no total ya en los tiempos actuales. Sin embargo, sí es muy importante reconocer que ya no es un prejuicio que se tiene de manera racial, como en la historia se había notado, sino que de igual manera es un prejuicio que ahorita ya se basa en fenómenos culturales y que en este sentido pues todavía queda mucho tramo justamente por recorrer. No veo otra pregunta. Hay muchos comentarios. Hay many, we don't have more questions for now, Professor Ricardo. But in the chat, everybody says that it's an excellent, excellent conference. Thank you very much in the name of UPAEP, in the name of Unitec, and in the name of the Personería of Colombia.
Thank you.
Pues a todos, muchísimas, muchísimas gracias. Agradecí ya a nuestro ponente. Les recuerdo que para las 11 de la mañana tenemos nuestra siguiente ponencia, debido proceso o debido trámite. Entonces, agradecemos mucho a nuestro ponente. Nuevamente agradecemos muchísimo
gracias.
A lo que es Unitec, a la UPAEP, igualmente también a todos ustedes, Latinoamérica, así como a las universidades también de la USAL en Argentina y la Red Metodista en Brasil, que nos han apoyado a lo largo de todos estos eventos. Todavía nos faltan más, hay muchas ponencias, todas ellas muy interesantes. Muchísimas gracias y nos vemos en un momento. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.